It's my pleasure to introduce our special guest today. I'm especially excited about it because I think he may be the first guest we've had, maybe at our synagogue. I don't know about that, but maybe at our synagogue with his own Wikipedia article. I don't know if we've ever had anyone who's listed in Wikipedia, so this is pretty exciting.
I didn't even know that.
There you go. You should search Wikipedia.
Wow.
Dr. David Breakstone is our guest, and I want to thank Janet and Erwin for making his appearance possible and for making the shidduch for us. He recently completed a term as deputy chair of the executive of the Jewish Agency for Israel. He previously served as deputy chair of the World Zionist Organization and conceptual architect and founding director of the Herzl Museum and Educational Center in Jerusalem. His latest venture is Israel Architects, Architexts, very creative, an enterprise promoting educational tourism and Israel engagement. I've just scratched the surface, so any gaps that you'd like to fill in, please feel free. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. David Breakstone live from Jerusalem.
Thank you. And I will add, as Erwin already mentioned, that I'm from right around the corner in Great Neck. And I come back there often. My 97-year-old mother is still living in the same house by herself that I grew up in. So
we're in Great Neck. We're in Great Neck.
The old village, Drury Lane, between Fairview and Hicks. More importantly, right around the corner from Erwin and Janet when they're not in Ra'anana. Literally 200 yards or so away from them. Although we didn't know each other when I was growing up. But indeed, I've been in Israel now since 1974. So that's a long time. And I will also add that I had the pleasure of speaking in your synagogue, actually on a Sunday morning once several years ago. It was a pleasure. Then when it was lunch and learn or breakfast and whatever, you actually got food. Pre-corona. So I'm a little familiar with the congregation, but only really from a distance. In any case, I've been asked to speak about anything I want to, which is always nice. I understand you've been dealing a lot with questions and discussion of the new government and what it portends. Let me start by, first of all, feel free to interrupt me with questions at any point. I'm not giving a lecture, just some thoughts and reflections. But I really think that this right now is the best government that Israel could have for several reasons. First of all, I think it gives expression to real hope and of the possibility of unity. You're all very well aware of the huge spectrum of parties, ideological and religious, that sit in this government, including for the first time an Arab party. Despite Bibi Netanyahu and others in the Likud labeling it a far-left government, the sitting prime minister, Naftali Bennett, of course, is far to the right, but certainly to the right of Netanyahu in his political views. Yesh Atid is a very centrist, some would say centrist right, some say centrist left, but certainly a centrist party. Kahol Lavan, I must say, nobody really knows what they stand for, still, at least as far as I'm concerned. But they're certainly not rabidly left-wing at all. And yet at the same time, you have the Labour Party, which is leftist in its leanings, and Meretz, which is certainly leftist. And of course, the Arab Party is to the left. So it really has a whole spectrum. It's really, there's never been a government, except when there's been a national unity government, that there's never been a ruling government with an opposition that was so diverse as this one. And I really do think that it's an expression of possibility of being able to get along and finding commonalities even when there are such huge differences. I think it's also the right government to have because it breaks the myth that nobody could lead the country except the Likud. And here I'm not talking about what one's own political leanings are and if they think the Likud is the right party or not the right party to lead the country. But I think it's very healthy in a democracy to recognize that there are choices, that there are viable alternatives, and not to feel that you're trapped into one particular way of looking at things, even if that's the way that you would like to see things. So I think that that's important. I think it's also important in terms of understanding that although there have been many that said nobody but Bibi can lead the country, again, to see that there are alternatives. There's a lot of talk of implementing a two-term limit on prime ministers altogether. Certainly the United States, well, I don't know if I want to say it hasn't suffered, but it certainly has managed for 2 centuries with, or it's not quite, no. Actually, the two-term limit only came around about 80 years ago or so, I think.
Right.
Right, but for the last 80 years, it's managed with good presidents and less good presidents, but 2 terms is enough. And I think it was becoming very unhealthy in Israel for people to have the feeling that there was but one leader. And here, again, it's not a personal thing whether Bibi was a good or not a good leader, but it's healthy for democracy to know that there are alternatives. I think it's also good because of the parties that are not there. There is an ultra right-wing Kahanist party that essentially by its own admission is racist and sees nothing wrong in that. That was really allowed into the Knesset through various backroom dealings. And I think it's bad enough that they were in the Knesset. It would have been even worse had they been in the government. It's just not what Israel stands for. Again, whether one is right wing or left wing, to have a blatantly racist party in the government is, I think, an embarrassment for a country that claims to be open and democratic. And I also think it's good that the ultra-Orthodox are not in the government. They've been sailing along for years with this sense of entitlement, that everything is coming to them. And besides the drain on the economy, there have been so many things that have been disturbing in terms of policies that they've insisted upon and that they've been able to implement because they were needed in a coalition. I think it's very healthy that there be a period of time when they are not in the government. Whether or not they come back in sometime in the future is another question, but I think it's important as well for there to be a break from that kind of stranglehold that the ultra-Orthodox had on the government. And the last reason why I think it's important, I mentioned the Arab Party, and again, one's personal political feelings aside, the fact that Arab citizens of Israel, they are indeed citizens. We're not talking about the people in the territories and the Palestinians and so on, but those who are full-fledged citizens of Israel, for us to finally have a government where they have some sense of belonging, I think is extremely important. The whole government, of course, is very fragile, and this is one of the things that makes it fragile, that the agreement, essential agreement of the government, the basic guidelines for the government were that they would not deal with issues like the Palestinian conflict and territorial withdrawal or what's the word, annexation. Whether or not they will survive through that, I don't know, and eventually that is going to have to be confronted. But the fact that this Arab party has publicly stated, and in terms of what it's demanded for joining the government, has really been simply to ease the or improve the conditions for the Arab citizens of Israel, I think is very commendable. And it probably could not have happened in a government that was left-wing. It has to be in a government that's really centrist and right-wing, that has centrist and right-wing parties as well, in order for their involvement to be meaningful and to get anywhere. So that being said, it still is a government that faces incredible challenges. The first, indeed, with some of the talk before I was introduced, was about what's going on in Lebanon. And it's already been stated that if a war develops there and Israel retaliates in any kind of ongoing way, that it could bring about the end of the government, because the Arab parties simply might not be able to support it. Interestingly, Nasrallah, the head of the Hezbollah, last night made a public speech saying that they are not interested in the current situation leading to a war. But certainly, if there is that kind of conflict that emerges, it could indeed bring about the end of the government. So that's one area that I'm not going to deal with, because the government has also said they're not going to deal with it. Another area that the government has said it's going to deal with, which of course is the whole health issue and the corona, is also an area I'm not going to deal with, because I know as little about this plague as the experts do. And we're learning day by day how little they really know. And it's certainly outside of my field of expertise, so I'm not going to deal with that. What I do want to spend a little time reflecting on, of course, is a whole other area, or a few other areas that impact on the Jewishness of the Jewish state, and in particular, the relationship between Israel and the Jewish communities of the diaspora. So there are three areas that I'll touch on. One is matters of religious pluralism, the Kotel, conversion, Aliyah, and so on. The second is a whole phenomenon of emerging communities around the world, which I will get into some detail about. And a third area, briefly, that I'll comment on is the matter of small Jewish communities, not emerging ones, long-established ones, like the Jewish community of Greece or Panama or Costa Rica, where we're really talking about just a couple of thousand Jews, and Israel's relationship to those communities and how it impacts really on all of us. So let me start with the religious pluralism area, and I'll start with the Kotel. I was actually at the Kotel on Tisha B'Av this year. I'm sure you've all heard reports of what took place there. The truth is, I think some of the reports in the paper were exaggerated. Indeed, there were those who wanted to get in our way, but there was no violence this time. There was no police. There was no need for police intervention. They were there praying in our space, and trying to drown us out with their voices, but fortunately it didn't escalate into violence. Unlike, let's see if I can, you see that picture?
Yes.
So that's me and my daughter back in 1997 at the Kotel, being escorted away by policemen. The headline here is, this was actually, the headline is from, I can't see. I'll tell you what it says. The headline was from 2000. The picture is from 1997. The headline is from the year 2000. And it says, for the first time, the conservatives will be able to pray alongside the Kotel. I share this with you only to emphasize how long this issue has been a real trigger point, and how long we've been struggling for our right to pray there in an egalitarian setting. And it looks like we made huge progress, we all thought, as you well know, a few years ago, when the decision was made to really create this pluralistic area. Have any of you been to the pluralistic area of the Kotel once it was established?
Mm.
Okay. In any case, just a few things in terms of this new government. First of all, there were formal agreements made between a number of the parties in the coalition that they would struggle for the full implementation of the Kotel agreement. And there have been outspoken supporters of it. I think most vociferously, it's been Nachman Shai, who's the Minister of the Diaspora, who has been very forceful in his statements that this will now come about. We should also recall, and I'm not sure if everybody knows, but it was actually Naftali Bennett, now the Prime Minister, who, I have to remember now in what capacity it was, but he was the one who really created the prayer space, the physical prayer space that now exists. And he, even as an Orthodox Jew, has also been forceful in his statement saying that how important this is to create. I'll also mention that a few weeks ago, there was a delegation of high-ranking leadership of the conservative movement in the United States that visited Israel. And they met with Nachman Shai and many of the other government ministers, laid out their expectations, got very positive responses. There were really no disappointments in terms of what was said, but it still is going to, the real test, of course, is going to be in terms of seeing what is actually implemented down the line, and we're still waiting to see what will materialize in that regard. Other positive developments in that respect is that a number of Orthodox, including very traditional and I would say even conservative with a small c, right-wing Orthodox rabbis have now spoken out publicly about the need to implement this agreement, stating categorically that they are in total disagreement with the approach of the reform and conservative movements. They think it's wrong to be praying together, but in the same breath, literally in the same breath, in the same articles, in the same op-ed pieces, in the same speeches, they've also said that they recognize that this is the way Judaism is expressed by a huge number of Jews around the world, and that by not allowing them the space that they need to pray as they see fit, they will further alienate and estrange these segments of the Jewish people, which in and of itself is against the whole concept of kihuv levavot, of welcoming people into the fold. And that's really a first that we're hearing from these kinds of rabbis. And interestingly, a few days ago, the new head executive director of the Masorti movement in Israel met with Rav Melamed, who up until now we've really seen as an enemy, but he's one of the leading rabbis who came out with the kind of statement that I just shared with you. And he met with her. It was supposed to be a half-hour meeting. It extended for 3 hours. And it ended with him saying that she could share publicly, it wasn't a secret meeting, don't tell anybody, you can share this publicly. And that, where that's going to go, we don't know. It's a ripple, but we hope it's a ripple that will keep extending and break down some of the resistance to implementing that the Kotel agreement. So at this point, there's no physical progress on the ground, other than actually one thing, and it is important. Some of you may recall that, I guess it was 2 years ago already, maybe even more, a huge stone fell out of the Kotel right onto the platform where we have been able to pray in a pluralistic manner. And it's taken an inexcusable amount of time to fix that stone. And they're now in the process of reinforcing all the stones in those areas to make sure that something won't happen. And if you go there now, you can actually see the construction taking place, or the restoration taking place. But in terms of meeting the three demands or the three elements of the agreement, we still haven't seen that happen. One of the elements, just to refresh your memories, there were three elements. One is that there would be a single entrance to the entire Kotel area. Right now, there's an entrance with security where you go to what's been the main traditional area of the Kotel. And 100 yards or so away, there's an entrance on the side, which you kind of have to look for, that brings you into the pluralistic area. And the initial agreement was that there'd be a single entry point where people would come in front of them, they would see, you go to the left, it's where the men are, you go to the middle, it's where the women are, and you go to the right, and it's where the egalitarian pluralistic area is, so that you wouldn't have to look for it. Everybody coming to the Kotel would be exposed to that. So that's one element that hasn't been met. Another element was that there would be access to the stones themselves. The way the platform has been built, there's only a tiny area of a couple of feet where you can actually touch the Kotel. And the plan that was approved a couple of years ago was that you would be able to actually go up and touch the stones, and that still hasn't been.
Yes, Avram, I'm in a meeting. I'm in a meeting. I got your message.
All right, go on.
Just my camera. Okay. So we're optimistic, cautiously optimistic, not overly optimistic that things really will move in the right direction. Another area, the whole matter of conversions. First of all, the biggest development in that regard was a Supreme Court decision of, I guess, a couple of months ago already, a few months ago already, that recognizes reform and conservative conversions that take place in Israel. Again, it's a very complicated issue, and I don't expect everybody to be aware of all of the details, but up until that Supreme Court decision, reform and conservative conversions performed outside of Israel were recognized by the state, but there was no such thing as a legally recognized non-Orthodox conversion in Israel. I should say no conversion that was not sanctioned by the chief rabbinate. There had been one exception to that a couple of years ago when some Haredi rabbi in Bnei Brak was converting people, and not through the chief rabbinate, but under his own auspices. And his conversions were recognized by the state, which really opened the door as a legal precedent for the reform and conservative movement to say, then ours should also be. Once you've broken the monopoly of the chief rabbinate, then you have to recognize our conversions as well. And that has now happened, which really opens the door for all sorts of possibilities. That being said, I don't want to go into all the details because I'm sure you've discussed, I understand you've discussed it, the whole matter of the Abu Yadaya and their recognition. Josh, is that something that...
we really haven't touched on that.
Oh, okay. Are people familiar with the Abu Yadaya community in Uganda?
Janet and
Well,
Irwin.
yeah, we are.
Yeah,
That was when Rabbi Krauser was here. He was very involved with Abu Daya, and he actually wrote a book about it. But I think this group could, it would be helpful to share that information.
Okay, so I'll give a quick review of that. The Abu Yadaya is a community of about 2,000 Jews living in Uganda. They make no claim of having Jewish roots. Very quickly, about 102 years ago, British missionaries, Christian missionaries, came into Uganda and tried to convert the people there to Christianity. And the chieftain of one of the tribes was converted, and he did some to Christianity, and he began studying more and learning more. And he came to the conclusion, why go for the Sud Bet, for second class religion, when you can go right to the source? And he circumcised his sons, and in turn the whole rest of the tribe, and they started living a traditional Jewish life over 100 years ago. They really came into contact with Western modern Jewry only a couple of decades ago. Until then, they were really living a pre-Talmudic, biblical-based Jewish life. But certainly Shabbat and Kashrut and Taharat HaMishpacha, all of these things were really integral to the way that they were living. And in the year 2000, they somehow connections were created between them and the conservative movement. Living a Jewish life or not, they had never formally converted by any authority, and the conservative movement took upon itself to teach and allow the conversion of this community. That started in 2002. The conversions really began. The study started in 2000, I believe. In 2002, they started converting, and it got to the point where now Rabbi Geshem Sizomu, who is a descendant of the original chieftain of the tribe, was sponsored and studied for the rabbinate, both at the Schechter Institute, and was eventually ordained by the the conservative movement's rabbinical school in California. And he went back in 2008 or 2009 and has since been the spiritual leader of the community, a very prominent, well-educated public figure. He was actually a member of the Ugandan Knesset, as well as being the rabbi of the community, the parliament, the Ugandan parliament, for a number of years. Unfortunately, he was just defeated in an election bid. He was part of the opposition, and he was ousted from his position. But I just mentioned that in order to illustrate the kind of prominence that he had and the visibility of the community. In 2016, the Jewish Agency, which is authorized by the Ministry of the Interior to recognize Jewish communities abroad, officially recognized the Abu Yadaya as a Jewish community. But unfortunately, the recognition was only retroactive to 2009. It was before my time in the Jewish Agency. I don't know exactly how it happened. Nobody, even the people involved, can really tell me. It was kind of passed over. The reason why they chose, why the Jewish Agency chose 2009 is because that's when Rabbi Geshem started serving there. And it's when the Jewish Agency, who were looking into the matter, felt that the community really had all of the institutions that it needed in order to be a fully functioning community. And the people within the Masorti movement didn't pay much attention to it. But as a result, it now turns out that all those who were converted before 2009, which is about 90% of the community, are not recognized as Jews by the state of Israel. because the state of Israel says you have to be converted in a recognized Jewish community, and you converted in a community that wasn't recognized. And this has come before the Supreme Court because we've had a number of cases, too many to go into this evening or this lunchtime, depending where we are. We've had people to participate, for instance, in a Taglit program or a Masab program, the birthright and long-term Israel programs. One has to be, it's interesting, to participate in a Masab program, you don't even have to be Jewish. You have to be eligible to move to Israel under the law of return, which ironically allows in lots and lots and lots of Russians who were born to a Jewish father, but not to a Jewish mother, or to even to have Jewish grandparents, because according to the law of return, you just have to have a single Jewish grandparent in order to be eligible. You don't have to be halachically Jewish, but so you can have young Russians who are not practicing Judaism in any way, shape, or form, allowed to immigrate and to participate in these programs, whereas you have highly observant, well Jewishly educated Abu Yadayins who are not allowed in because they're not eligible according to the law of return. And this is a terrible situation that we've been dealing with and struggling against for years, really for years. And there was also, I'll just take the case of one individual, Joseph Kabita, who is a volunteer on Kibbutz Keturah in the Arava, down south, who applied for Aliyah. He got into Israel on a tourist visa. He applied for Aliyah. He waited months and months and months. His application eventually was not only rejected, but he was also handed a deportation order that he had to leave the country within a couple of weeks or face deportation. Iraq, not the Iraq that's threatening Israel, but the Israel Religious Action Center took up his case, and we were able to get a stay of the order, and he was allowed to stay on in the country until his case, which was then brought before the Supreme Court, would eventually be resolved. And he was really a test case for us in that his conversion took place prior to 2009. And the Supreme Court ruled on his case finally. It's been in the process for over 2.5 years. But his case was finally dealt with a few months ago. And I don't know if I want to say, well, unfortunately, it was basically what happened was the judge said to those who had brought the case and to Joseph Kabita, withdraw your case, because if you force us to decide upon it, since your conversion was prior to 2009, we really have to go on this precedent that it has to be within a recognized Jewish community, and whether correctly or incorrectly, the recognition by the Jewish agency is only from 2009 onwards. But the judge also said, go convert again in a recognized community and then come back to me. So in the meantime, a couple of weeks later, the court case that I mentioned before, that reform and conservative conversions in Israel would be recognized. Joseph Kabita has now gone through a conservative conversion in Israel. He's the first one after this ruling. And his case has now been brought back before the Supreme Court to allow his Aliyah application to be accepted. And hopefully within certainly within a few months, hopefully less, I would expect that we'll get an answer. But that's not going to resolve the question of recognizing the others in the community. So what we've done as well is we've now initiated a MASA program. MASA is the long-term Israel programs that I mentioned, that you have to be eligible for Aliyah in order to participate in them. We're now organizing a MASA program from Uganda of the Abu Yadayan. And what we want is for all of the young, it's for young people, there'll be about 10 of them probably. We want all of them to go through a conversion, Giur L'Chumra, and like an extra conversion to alleviate any concerns of its authenticity, that will take place post 2009, obviously, among the Abu Yadayans. And if they're allowed to come in that capacity, it will really open the door completely for the recognition. But I don't want to, there's another complication here, which is the position of the Ministry of the Interior up until now has been that the Jewish agency's recognition of the community was not valid to begin with, because there's no such thing as a community composed entirely of non-Jews converting to Judaism as being recognized. There's no justification whatsoever that I have been able to find for that in any of the protocols and so on. But that's been their contention up until now. And the matter really has to be, will have to come again before the Supreme Court. So these are all issues. Now, up until now, the Minister of the Interior has been Aryeh Deri for the last, God knows how many years. He's the head of the Shas, ultra-Orthodox Shas party. And he has been, to say, staunchly against recognizing such communities is an understatement. He's never even formally acknowledged the 2016 decision of the Jewish Agency to recognize the Abu Yadaya. It was sent to him, and he was supposed to basically rubber stamp it. Every time that the head of the Jewish Agency would go to him and say, "What's with this thing?" The people would say, "Well, it's on his desk." And so it's either been on his desk or in his trash basket for 5 years. And now we have a new Minister of the Interior, which brings us back to the new government. We don't know how Ayelet Shaked is going to respond to these issues. And there is a delegation of Masorti leadership in Israel that's meeting, I think it's in next week, to lay out all the issues and to put it, to really make sure that we're well prepared to go into a meeting with her to try to get her to move on these issues, because ultimately it's the Minister of the Interior that has to rule on such matters as who can be allowed into the country and who can't. But we are very, very disturbed in that an op-ed piece just appeared a few days ago, written by I think he's a professor, the head of some council on exploring matters of conversion, who also serves as an advisor to Ayelet Shaked, and his op-ed piece was horrific. It was, it's basically, it's racist, and it basically says that anybody that can't claim Jewish descent, their conversion should not be accepted. That for the sake of the law of return, only those whoever wants to call themselves Jewish abroad, that's one thing, but for the sake of the law of return, a conversion should only be accepted from those who have links to the Jewish people, either born to a Jewish father and not a Jewish mother, or can prove descent from the Conversos, the Marranos, the Anusim from 500 years ago, and so on. And it would leave many thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of people out. And why do I say millions? The Abu Yadaya has to be taken in a larger context of this phenomenon of emerging communities that I mentioned earlier. Sitting in the United States, certainly in Little Neck and Great Neck, although I know since I left, we've become aware of the fact that not all Jews are Ashkenazi, and a lot come from Iran. I don't know if there are those in your congregation or those on this call, but I know growing up, there was one kind of Jew. And going back to Great Neck now, one becomes very much aware that there's lots of kinds of Jews. Certainly living in Israel, one sees that. But the Ministry of the Diaspora, a few years ago, only 3 or 4 years ago, commissioned a report on communities with an affinity to the Jewish people, is the way they labeled it. And they concluded in their report, that was a very thorough report, that there are 35 million people around the world who have an affinity to the Jewish people that they are aware of. It's mostly a phenomenon concentrated in Latin America, particularly in Brazil, but also throughout the African continent, in India with the B'nai Menashe. There are communities all over the place that claim some kind of connection to the Jewish people. Hundreds of thousands of them actually practicing Jewish lives. There's a huge, well, I won't go into this, there's all over the place. And when I was at the Jewish Agency, I was dealing with this phenomenon all the time. There were dozens of conversions, Haredi, ultra-Orthodox conversions in Nicaragua, people who wanted to come to Israel, and were really Haredi in their lifestyle, in their practice, in their learning, and were not allowed to come. At one point, the Jewish Agency's representative in Bogota, Colombia, had 82 Aliyah files that had all been completed by converts who claimed to be descendants of the Marranos, the Conversos, the Anusim, and the Ministry of the Interior refused to even open their files and look at them. I mentioned the B'nai Menashe. They claim to be descendants of the lost tribe of Menashe in India. There's 5,000 or so still in India. There's a few thousand that were allowed under strange circumstances into Israel, and they're fighting for recognition. Nigeria, I don't know if any of you followed the story of the Israeli reporters that were sent to jail. They were there, it doesn't matter the details, but there's a whole community in Nigeria. There's the Lemba in Africa. They're really all over the place. And this phenomenon, it's really only in the last decade that has come to people's attention. And it creates a huge number of questions, both theological, ideological, practical, and so on. I was very involved with this issue while at the Jewish Agency. What we did essentially was to commission a report or a study by the Jewish People Policy Institute, which is a very respectable academically founded research or policymaking think tank, basically. And they've just submitted a report that still isn't public on this phenomenon and how to deal with it. There are things, I'm not allowed to share the report itself, but I can tell you that there are things in that report that are very disturbing, and I will tell you very surprising to me. I'll just share one quote from that report in terms of its recommendations. They wrote, despite the fact that traditionally conversion to Judaism is open to individuals of all backgrounds, eligibility for conversion for purposes of the law of return should be based on verifiable descent from veteran ethno-religious Jews or marriage to someone with such a link, which is basically the same position that this professor that I mentioned earlier took. It really raises questions, even how we think about ourselves in terms of, are we an ethnicity, are we people, are we a religion? Is there a gene pool that people are afraid of diluting? It really raises huge questions, it's an issue that's definitely going to be getting a lot of attention, and something also that'll be coming up with the government. I have a meeting on, I think it's August 24th, with Nachman Shai, the Minister of the Diaspora, where I'll be bringing a number of these issues to his attention from the perspective of when I was working on them at the Jewish Agency, and how we might be able to move forward with them.
I have two questions. Can I?
Yeah.
Do you mind?
No, good, excellent. Go ahead.
Okay. One is when you talked about the non-acceptance of the Abu Daya. My understanding was that it wasn't the whole community that had like this, communal conversion, but that each individual member of the community went through a conversion under the conservative auspices. I mean, it wasn't like they took everybody at the same time to the sea and dumped them in as a mikveh. I mean, it wasn't like that, right? It was individuals. So
Right.
I don't understand someone saying, well, there's never been a precedent where an entire community, converted. Well, it's not really that. It's individuals. So that was one question. And the other question is, do you have an idea? You said 35 million of these Jews throughout the world who have an affinity to Jews and Judaism. Do you have any sense? Can you make a comment on the motivation for that and where that's coming from?
Okay.
And I'm like shocked. I never heard of such a thing.
Okay, so as to the first question, indeed, there was no mass conversion, but the reality is that the entirety of the community was converted. And that's what the Ministry of the Interior is saying, that you can't just pluck people out of the nowhere, and even if they're converted individually, and call that a Jewish community. As I said, I have no idea on what they're basing that, why they're saying that, where that's coming from, but that's their position. Plus, we have a little bit more of a complication, but it's really only a technical one. Although there were no mass conversions, a huge number of the conversions happened on the same day or on the same days over a period of years. Because what would happen is people would study individually and they'd get their training individually, but the Beit Din, which was imported from Chutz La'aretz, 3 conservative rabbis would come and they would meet individually with each person or with each family unit. I was actually there for some of the conversions, and I would see that the husband and wife and the children would come together, or very often it was a wife of a non-Jewish wife who had married a Jewish man and was converting. But the certificates were all signed on the same day, because they would do 25, 50, 100, whatever within a week, because that's, they came and it made more sense to do that. So we've been accused of mass conversions, even though it wasn't a mass conversion.
Could I ask you on that topic? Could I just ask you, what, from a reality point of view, to set a precedent? I'm not even thinking about conservative Judaism, but Reform Judaism. If you set a precedent that any group of people with an affinity, quote unquote, can decide that they want to come to the most successful Western style democracy in the Middle East, you're talking about tens of millions of people. And then when we have a community that's in trouble, a Jewish community, whether it's in the United States, which could happen, or from Europe, they're not going to, where are you going to put these people? You don't have room in the state of Israel to let the reform movement set a precedent. Oh, you want to move to Israel? Fine, we'll convert you. All you have to do is this, this, and this, and you're converted. I mean, you're setting a very dangerous precedent that will overwhelm the country. And I think that they're being careful about whom they're going to accept, because once you set that precedent, then you have to let in the reform and the reconstructionists and the conservative and anybody else that decides that they have some kind of connection to Judaism. And, it's like, it's a little bit like the refugee problem we have in this country, where in the last 6 months, over 1 million people have come in illegally, plus the United States lets in another 1.1 million, legally. And they overwhelmed the border, they overwhelmed the country. What's the reality? I mean, why are you
the reality? So I can turn the question back to you, which is, what is the law of return something that we believe in, or is it something that has served its time and should be repealed? There are those arguing on the basis of what you've just said, is that the purpose of the law of return was to make sure that those who were persecuted, Holocaust survivors, and so on, would have a place. Nobody's in danger anymore. Now we should repeal the law of return.
No, we are in danger. We are very much in danger. In Europe, we're very much in danger. In the United States, within the next few years, depending on what happens, we are very much in danger. And I'm a survivor. And I'm telling you that what we're seeing happening with anti-Semitism in the world today, you would be, pulling the wool over your eyes if you think we're not in danger.
So what I hear you suggesting is that the law of return should be amended so that Israel remains a shelter for those who are persecuted, but those who want to come for ideological positive reasons have to wait online.
Yeah.
Okay, that's one position. I didn't come to a country only for those who needed it. It certainly needs to be a shelter and a refuge for those who need it. But I very much want here the people who are coming for positive reasons to.
Right, but you're Jewish. You have a right to come to Israel.
And the Abu Yadaya are not?
I don't know.
Okay, so this raises the question, the law of return says that every Jew or every person born to a Jewish mother or who converted is allowed to come into the state of Israel. And you're raising the question of who is a Jew. And the ultra-Orthodox have had a monopoly on that for generations. And those in the more progressive movements, both reform and conservative, have argued that there are many who are Jewish that the chief rabbinate doesn't accept. So it is a delicate issue. It's definitely a delicate issue. What has been decided absolutely is that it's not anybody can come along and say that they're Jewish, no matter how they converted. It has to be in the reform and conservative movement, only those who are recognized as having gone through a conversion in accordance with the standards of the rabbinical assembly are recognized. And we have had cases of conservative rabbis who have done online conversions of people that the Knesset HaRabbanim, the rabbinical assembly, has not accepted them and said that this is not in accordance with our standards and our practice. So it's not anybody can say, it's the established streams are supposed to have the authority to determine their own standards. And as soon as we would take that away from it, we would be saying that Israel, in fact, is not the state of the entirety of the Jewish people. It's only the state of those who the Orthodox recognize as being Jewish. So it is complex. By the way, these communities, and I'll now get back to the rabbi's question of this report that I mentioned. Let's see if with the glare on this, that's not. So this is a report. It says on the top, the Ministry of Diaspora Affairs, and it's a report. Sorry, this isn't showing up. But report of the Public Advisory Committee for examining Israeli approach regarding world communities with affinity to the Jewish people. And in this report, let's see if this page shows up with less glare. These are different concentric circles of the Jewish people. And they say that there are about 6 million Jews in Israel. There are about 9 million people that are eligible for the law of return who are not halachically Jewish, and that includes particularly in the former Soviet Union. There's about 8 million undisputed Jews in the diaspora. And then they say down here, there are 35 publics with an affinity for the Jewish people known to us, about 35 million people. I look at that number and I say, this is nonsense. I've read the report. I don't know where they came up with that, but that's what they're claiming. I'll just mention in the same breath that a non-Jewish academic team issued a report less than 2 years ago, I believe, saying that 24% of all Latin Americans have significant Jewish genes. I don't know how many of you have done 23andMe, the genetic test where, you know, I come out 97% Ashkenazi Jewish, 3% Eskimo or whatever. So this report of non-Jewish academics with no agenda came up with 24% of all Latin Americans have significant Jewish genetic DNA. I read it a little bit further. That was what the headlines were in the newspaper. When I looked at the report, it turns out that significant was registered at 7%. So that means, you know, it's already only 7% of them have only 7% of their genes are Jewishly related. But it certainly suggests that there's a phenomenon out there of a lot of people knocking on our doors. And as I said, the vast, vast, vast majority of them are not at all interested in making Aliyah. There are communities in Brazil that I've met with the leaders of them. They just want to be part of the Brazilian Jewish community. But the Jewish Federation of Brazil is very hesitant. And there are all sorts of questions that are raised in terms of, again, questions for us to ask ourselves in terms of how we see ourselves and what makes us Jewish. Is it by birth? Is it by belief? Is it by practice? Is it by DNA? And again, are we a people or are we a religion? What makes us who we are? And that's a discussion. I see it's already 8:30. That's a discussion you'll have to have on your own at some point. It's really, it's really a soul-searching question, I think, for all of us. So I'm gonna end here, and I'll end. You know, it's in our tradition to always end on a positive note, particularly with all of the challenges that I've raised that we're facing. I mentioned that I'm going to be meeting with Dr. Nachman Shai in a couple of weeks. And the good news is that he just established within his Ministry of Diaspora Affairs a special department for promoting or for the encouragement of progressive Judaism with a budget of 40 million shekels, which is not a huge amount of money, but it's about, I guess it's about 13 million dollars. And even if it's not huge money, it really sets a precedent and gives expression to what he, as the Minister of the Diaspora, believes in. It's the first time that there has been such a department set up. And I think it should be very encouraging to all of us, and hopefully will give us some indication of where this new government will be taking us in terms of relations with the diaspora overall, and particularly with the reform and conservative movements. So if there's another question or two, I'll be happy to.
David, before you go, it's really just a clarification. And it was about the give and take between you and Eva a little bit. And I think that there's a big difference between, you said, well, you made Aliyah not because you were oppressed, but because for ideological reasons. And you would hate to not have the law of return not open for those reasons. And so Eva said, well, that's because, but you're Jewish. And there's a very big difference, I think, but from that. I mean, if you think about, well, you know, the diaspora started, you know, when we were kicked out by the Romans, and you know, and we trace our lineage to all of the Jews who went to all the different areas in the world. And you know, that there is a sense of, you know, the Jewish people. It's wonderful if people are interested in converting. We've always, well, we've said, you know, you welcome with one hand and push away with the other, and you make sure that they really want to for the right reasons, and that's a whole part of a really important part of the conversion process. But I think that this 35 million people that you're mentioning that are sort of interested, you said a lot of them don't even want to make Aliyah. Okay, but I don't know about people converting so that they can make Aliyah, or converting so that they can, be part of that aspect of the Jewish people. I think that's a very, very, there's a difference between that kind of conversion. That's why I asked the original question, which is, what is the motivation of these people? What, you know, we always say, you know, that we frown on if someone, converts just for marriage, you know, and do they really understand what it is to be Jewish? And are they going to become practicing, members of our people, or is it just a pro forma thing to make the grandparents happy? You know, there are a lot of problems with conversion in many different areas, and I think that to answer your question about, well, do you think that the law of return has reached its limit and we shouldn't do it anymore? Of course not. That whole concept that Israel is the Jewish homeland for all Jews, wherever we may be living, but that doesn't mean that extends to people that convert in order to get into Israel under the law of return. I mean, that's
Correct.
A whole different idea.
That already in the bylaws for interpreting the law of return, it states explicitly that a conversion for the sake of Aliyah is not allowed. Is not, that person is not in. And we've had many cases where we've had individuals who within the conservative movement we believe did not convert for such a purpose, but have been kept out because they were accused of having converted for such purposes. And it depends who's making the decisions. And unfortunately, it's not been us who's been making the decisions. It's been the ultra-Orthodox and the Minister of the Interior that's been making the decisions. But with the Abu Yadaya, as I said, their conversions or their practice of Judaism began 100 years ago. There was no Israel. There was no talk of Aliyah. There was Yerushalayim, Shamala, and so on. And even now, this Joseph Kabita on Kibbutz Keturah is he's the only one who has applied for Aliyah. There are others, however, who want to come and study in the conservative yeshiva or to participate in other programs, who are being kept out because they're not eligible for Aliyah, so they can't even come and spend 6 months and study in Israel. And that is, to me, reprehensible. I've suggested setting up a special track within the Masal long-term programs for those for whom there is reasonable basis for considering that they are Jewish, to allow them to come and study, with it stated explicitly for the time being that this should not be interpreted as a precedent for allowing them to come and live here, just to allow them to come and study. And they've been kept out. We had Yehuda Kimani and Abu Yadai, who came in December 2018. He arrived in Israel to study at the conservative yeshiva. He had a valid visa stamped by Israel's ambassador, and he was held overnight at the airport and deported the next morning because he was not considered Jewish, and he was just.
But I'm sorry, that doesn't sound like that is that is according to Israeli law. I mean, just because you're not Jewish doesn't mean you can't go to Israel to study. I mean,
Right.
You don't need to be Jewish to go and study.
So the person who kept him out was called before the Knesset, and I was there. There was a committee on the Aliyah and Absorption Committee, and the response of the head of the population registry said, "What, you want me to let in half of Africa?" That was his response. What, you want me to let in half an Africa? And then he said, "And you can't study in a yeshiva if you're not Jewish." At which point, those of us who were there said, first of all, he is Jewish. And second of all, who are you to decide that somebody who's not Jewish can't study at the conservative or at any yeshiva, never mind, the conservative yeshiva. And he was
that person in charge of making that decision.
Sorry?
Why was that person in charge of making that?
He was the head of the population registry, and he's a racist. He's a racist.
Yeah, but I understand that. But what about the minister of I don't know of
his minister was Aryeh Deri, who gave him complete support. What we ended up doing through the courts was we allowed for Yehuda Kimani to come back on a 6-month student visa. You don't have to be Jewish to come on a student visa. And he was allowed to come into the country and study. And he's now very happily back at home leading. He's now the spiritual leader. He's not a rabbi, but the leader of his community in Kenya. He's in Kenya, and he's developing a wonderful, vibrant, beautiful Jewish community there that's not interested in making Aliyah. When I was in Uganda 2 years ago, this past July, for their centennial celebrations, I said to Rabbi Gershom, I said, why aren't they all applying to come on Aliyah? And he said, David, what are they going to do in Israel? Here, if they're hungry, they go out and they pick a mango and they have something to eat. They're not going to, they can't function in it. They're a third world country. They live in literally mud homes and thatched roofs with no running water and no electricity. Their Shabbat is beautiful, though. I've got videos of their tefillot, not from Shabbat, but at other times. I was teaching them. Did a session on a Shabbat afternoon, and just before I sat down to do it, I said, "What have I prepared here?" They're never going to be able to follow what I've done, and I was blown away by how how much they participated actively, what their background was. They're very, very different than us, but it doesn't matter. I'm going off on a tangent. Anyway, the questions are very real. But the bottom line is, as far as I'm concerned, there's a lot of prejudice both against Jews of color, and I know that that's now a big issue in the United States as well. It's very hard for people in Israel to accept Jews of color.
What?
And it's, yeah, yes, there's a lot of, it's terrible. And those who are conservative and reform are also, I'm sure I don't need to tell you, the prejudice here against the ultra. When I say it, I'm talking about essentially the ultra Orthodox community. That is just I really do believe they do not want the Jewish gene pool diluted or polluted. That's what it comes down to. And I've had enough conversations with people in positions of authority to really be able to make that statement with, they're not even embarrassed. They're not embarrassed. I mean, Jewish tradition over the generations, there's always been arguments about whether or not we should be open to conversion or not. And as the rabbi said, there's always pushing away with one hand. Anybody who comes to convert, you have to tell them 3 times that they can't convert. Right? That's I don't know where that's
That's
actually
the halakha.
right. You got to tell them no 3 times. So it's not like we've been welcoming. And there are communities. You go to Mexico, you go to Panama. There is no such thing. They do not accept converts in their communities. They just don't. They don't accept converts. Period. They don't want to get involved with it. So these are definitely disturbing issues, but we have people knocking at our door, not the door of Israel specifically, but the door of the Jewish people. And there are questions we have to ask ourselves before we decide if to let them in or not let them in. So,
David, I apologize for for asking all these questions, but I appreciate your responses and I appreciate the opportunity to sort of chime in. And this is a discussion for the next time that you come, because it really is a huge thing. But I think what you've just done is you've shared with us a little bit of dirty laundry about some things about Israel that I know it's pretty clear that you're not happy about it, and that you called this minister a racist, and it's like unfortunate, unfortunate things happen, and we always talk about how Israel's not perfect, but nonetheless that doesn't give us any reason to delegitimize the ability of Israel to be the Jewish homeland for the Jewish people. But having said that, and I think you mentioned that in the 3 areas that you were going to talk about, or maybe I heard it wrong, is that a huge thing for me as an American rabbi, and a huge thing for us as members of the American Jewish community, where there is a huge challenge of anti-Zionism and anti-Israel and pro-Palestinian. And I mean, we're living in a time where it's very, very difficult, particularly for our college students, to be pro-Israel and even pro-Jewish, on campus. And we've talked a lot about the anti-Israel as the new anti-Semitism. So all of that, the looming question is that with all of the warts of our beloved state of Israel, that in so many ways is a light unto the nations and is a miracle in the modern day. And I could go on and on and on, because I am an Ahavat Yisrael and I am an advocate of Israel, and I've been to Israel at least 12 times. And I believe wholeheartedly in Israel as being the, Reshit Tzmichat Geulatenu. Having said all that, you brought to this discussion today some difficult topics, difficult things that are happening, and there are other difficult things, that we are confronted with on a regular basis. The treatment of Israeli Palestinians by Israelis, the occupation, all those things. And we don't have time for that. But I wanted to just sort of say this to put it in your mind and put it on the table, that if you're able to come back and join us, to say, well, from your perspective as an Oleh, as an Israeli citizen, as someone who is committed to Masorti Judaism and all the things that you are, and your positions in the various ministries, what kind of guidance can you give to those of us in the diaspora who want to be advocates for Israel and are finding it a very huge challenge?
Okay, that's a great segue into the next session. It's really much too.
No, I said not for now. I said that. I said.
And I will also reiterate one of the things that you just said. And I just moved over so that you can see Herzl behind me. This is my home office now. You see that poster of Herzl there. So he's always there. And in fact, I've got Herzl all over you can't see, it doesn't matter. I've got Herzl all over the place, constantly reminding me that what we set out to do was not only to create a safe place to live in, that's crucial, that's critical. It was when we started, it continues to be today, but we always wanted to create this Chevrat Mofet, in Herzl's terms as well, an exemplary society, in addition to the shelter. And that's what we're striving to do today. You said as an Oleh, as a citizen, with all my positions, I'll also add with now, thank God, 15 grandchildren here. That's too, I don't regret for, this is where I would want them to be. I wouldn't have done anything differently. I believe, as you do, in Israel as a light onto the nations. But there's a lot of work to be done. And I'll go back to my opening statement. I think the government that we have now is the right government to take us on the next step forward. And I don't say that from the right, I don't say it from the left, as I said in my introductory remarks. You've got them both in that government. But that willingness, that striving to work together for a common goal and to find those things which really need to characterize us as the kind of Jewish state that we envision is what continues to guide us. And I could have given an even longer talk on 1,000,001 positive things about Israel and the things that are going on today. But I think, especially for a group like this that's so committed, we shouldn't, that commitment should be unconditional, but it shouldn't be blind. It should recognize fully the challenges that are out there, because if we don't recognize the challenges, if we don't see them, we're not going to be able to meet them. So I'll be glad on one of my returns. Next time I'm back in Great Neck, I'll let you know if you're having in-person events again. What's it look like? Just 2 minutes. What's it look like for the high holiday?
David, thank you very much. Janet would like to say something since she brought you on. She's the one. So would you hold on, please?
Okay.
Okay. What'd I do? What did I do?
We can hear
Hello?
you. We just can't. We can hear you. We just can't see. Oh, there you
Okay.
Now we can even see you.
David, I expected everything that you had to say. And I'm going to end by saying this. I think the conservative and the reform movement in the United States it's very important that we concern ourselves with the issues that you spoke about. But I do not feel that the conservative and reform movement in the United States, which is what I know about, are not supportive enough of Israel and take it upon themselves to delegitimize with the BDS movement and other things. And this is what bothers me when it comes to working with them for all the reforms that we need to have in Israel to make it a true democracy. And certainly I have worked towards it for many, many, many years, and with you, David, on many of these issues. But at this point, I still feel that it behooves the conservative and the reform movement to come forth and be a little bit more positive instead of being so negative.
I agree, and I hope that delegation that was here now of the conservative movement with Jacob Blumenthal and so many others, including Saray, and she was on this delegation as well. The current leadership of the conservative movement was here, and I hope that they will take the same message back to their constituencies, Janet, that you just shared, because as the rabbi said as well, the warts are there, but it doesn't in any way justify in the tiniest bit any of the delegitimization and so on. All right, I'm going to leave you all now. You can continue with your lunch. I hope it's a good lunch.
I want to thank you, Dr.
And
Breakstone.
Thank you, David. I'll speak to you on the phone.
Thank you for a
Okay.
very informative
Thank
session,
you.
and you're welcome back anytime. So thank you so
Wonderful.
much.
Thank you.